So, Phil, we're going to talk about the current state of the trade show and exhibition industry. But before we do that, the last time you were on my podcast was, can you believe it, 2.5 years ago now? It was October 2020. I just want to ask you, looking back at that time and obviously the subsequent couple of years, what's your sort of overriding emotion now when you look back and think about how the individuals reacted and organisations responded during the pandemic?
I think in a nutshell, of course, we were in a situation where a lot of people are asking questions about, can the trade show industry survive this? Can it survive the pandemic, etc., 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 and an enormous amount of pivot to digital. And what has been really interesting is that we've moved from this is a crisis for trade shows. This is a crisis for the valuation of trade show companies like my companies, like CloserStill and 19. And we've moved actually to almost the opposite end of the spectrum, which is actually trade shows have survived this amazingly well. And if trade shows can survive a pandemic, they can survive anything. And while we don't have proof of it yet, you could argue that because of that, trade shows are even more valuable than they were before the pandemic, because they've proved their resilience in a remarkable way.
Sure. And we're going to get into some of that. I just want to show you, I want to play a 15-second clip from our conversation in October. So bear with me. I'm just going to play this.
Over 800 years, trade shows have survived wars, pestilences, floods, heaven knows what else. They survived the Black Death, they survived the plague, they survived numerous plagues, they survived Spanish flu. And I can't see a strong argument for saying they won't survive this in broadly the same format.
So that was 2.5 years ago. Do you think you were proved right?
Very, very prescient, and you can see the Dachshunds behind me as well. Well, it would appear so, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, ask me in 5 years' time, but yeah, basically, and it is true. I mean, trade shows in this format have existed for 800 years, and they have survived just about everything. So, I mean, as long as there's trade, as long as people want to get together and talk to each other about business matters and social matters, then why won't trade shows survive?
Sure. And broadly, do you think the recovery curve has been as you would expected? And I'd be interested to sort of hear your views about different nuances within that, maybe different regions. I mean, obviously we'll come on to China in a minute, but just broadly.
Yes, you just mentioned China. China is the obvious exception. I think that there's a lot of evidence, anecdotal, and a lot of work has been done on the major regions. And certainly the UK and the US appear now, if we take 2023, to have recovered back to 2019 levels. Not every show, obviously. Sure. And obviously you've got companies like CloserStill, which are 50% plus ahead of where they were in 2019. Europe, still a little bit behind. The Messen have been having a hard time of it. But the Messen, of course, are much more dependent on genuine worldwide international events, and particularly exhibitors from the Asia-Pacific region. And therefore, they're running behind. How far behind? Hard to say. You can't get straightforward information there, but probably 10 to 20%. But that reflects the fact that they are a truly international market, the German market,
sure,
as opposed to the UK and the US, which are, let's face it, provincial markets ultimately. But the exception is China. And there's no point me saying, I think China is here, I think China is there. I don't think anybody knows how far China has come back from where it was in 2019. Is it at 60%, 70%, 80%? I don't know, and nor does anybody else.
Sure. So that's a wait and see. I want to dig a bit deeper into the UK for a minute. The AEV, for those that aren't aware, the Association of Event Venues, recently published their size and scale index report for the UK exhibition
report,
industry.
Which I get involved in. I kind of authenticate it for them.
Sure. And as I understand it, was the first report they've published since 2019.
Yes, that's correct.
And ultimately, the report shows year-on-year comparisons across key event industry metrics and includes trends and analysis. I've had a look at some of the summary findings, of which I know you've commented on recently. I just want to touch upon 2 or 3 of those points. One interesting thing, which I didn't realise, is that it suggests that half of shows now are annual.
Yes,
only half of them
I
are
don't
annual.
I don't know how to read that. I don't
Yeah.
know whether that means what has happened, because they were looking at 2022.
Sure.
And the calendar was still way out of sync in 2022. And therefore, I think you probably need a year or two to see whether that works or not, because that doesn't add up, Dan. I mean, you and I know large numbers of shows, and shows that are annual are still shows that are annual.
Sure. And also, what would be the benefit of not running it annually? I mean, is it typically, to get an international audience? I don't know. I can't really see the benefit of running it, in your experience, every other year or once every 3 years. I know Tarsus have done that model in a number of their sectors. What are the main benefits of not running it annually?
Well, I mean, Tarsus, of course, have got Label X and Dubai Air Show.
Yeah.
And Label X has been a biennial show forever. The big one in Brussels. Dubai Air Show was all started as a biennial, partially because you have other shows like Farnborough and Paris in the cycle, and therefore we're trying to get into an international cycle. There are plenty of sectors. DSEI is another big one, where the rate of change is not such that there is a strong argument for an annual show. I mean, IPEX, which was one of the 5 or 6 biggest shows in the UK, owned by Informa, the big printing machinery show, was every 4 years until it disappeared. And that again was because printing machinery doesn't change at any great rate, and it made sense to run it every 4 years.
Okay. Another sort of fact that came out of it was that the biggest single number of trade events were now in the medical sector. I think it suggested.
Yes, that's right. As opposed to the leisure, giftware, houseware, etc. sector.
Sure.
That's new. I mean, again, from CloserStill's point of view, I mean, half of CloserStill's turnover is in medical healthcare events. We have 17 medical healthcare events in the UK alone. That doesn't prove a great deal. It just happens to show that it's a sector that we're very, very aware of it. I wonder whether that's a surprise. I mean, does it actually suggest that medical and healthcare is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or does it suggest that sectors like giftware are getting smaller?
Sure.
You can read that both ways, can't you? But in the sense that healthcare is a growing percentage of gross domestic product in every single major economy and continues to grow at a material rate, you would expect trade shows to reflect that.
Sure,
it's one of the reasons. I mean, when Andy and I started CloserStill, I mean, we didn't have many driving absolutes. But one was to try only to invest in sectors which were a growing percentage of GDP.
Sure.
And we've stuck to that.
What's your view on what it suggested with regards to gross space? And you might want to give a definition between gross and net and why it reports on gross. I guess because it's from a venue perspective and they're interested in the whole floor. It suggests that gross space has been in decline. But I know you've got your own views on that.
Yeah, I'd have quite strong views on this. I mean, yes, it's the AUV you're doing it, so it's for the venues, and therefore, from the venues' point of view, gross space is more. Gross space is what they get paid for, as opposed to net space. I think there has clearly been a decline in gross space and in visitors from 2015. But I think the problem with that is that unfortunately, the SASE report takes as its base year 2015. And that's because that was the first year the AUV did the report. So I don't blame them for that. But unfortunately, we do have pretty reasonable figures going back quite a long way, showing broad trends in exhibitors, square meters, visitor numbers, etc., going back to about 1989. And what is clear is that 2015 was the peak of the cycle. If you take 2010 as your starting point, you'll find that 2022 is about the same level as 2010, 2011 in terms of gross square meters, net square meters, and visitors. And what happened is post the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we saw a gradual and quite significant increase in the size of exhibitions, the number of visitors over that period, up to about 2015, rising about 10 to 12% over that 5-year period. And then we hit this brick wall. And the brick wall, so from 2016 onwards, we started seeing a decline in net square meters, gross square meters, and visitor numbers. And you can ascribe that, as I have in my comments, to one of two things. One is it's a natural cycle. Cycles go up and down. It's a sine curve.
Sure.
There's nothing, it doesn't particularly mean anything. Or you can ascribe it to the fact that a year later, of course, we hit Brexit. And Brexit clearly, when you look at exhibitor numbers coming to shows from 2016, 2017 onwards, Brexit clearly had a significant effect on the industry. I'm not saying it was a 20% hit. It doesn't need to be a 20% hit. A 1 or 2% hit can be quite significant. You lose 2% of your exhibitors, and it's a significant amount. And what we've seen since 2015, which was the peak, is we've seen a slow decline of around, I would say, 1 to 1.5% a year in terms of net square meters, gross square meters.
Sure.
And it's not consistent, but it seems to be there and it seems to be real. And and it's not true in France. It's not true in Germany. It's not true in Spain. We run lots of shows in France, Germany, and Spain, and we have plenty of stats from those markets. It's something that applies in Europe to the UK, and therefore it's hard to ascribe it to anything other than Brexit.
Sure. But actually, given everything that's been thrown at the trade show industry here and elsewhere, those statistics and that level of potential decline actually suggest that the industry's held up pretty well over that period.
It has held up well. I mean, you can actually say 2022, we're performing just as well as we were in 2010, 2011. And that's factually, as far as I can tell, that's factually correct. So you can actually say that over a 10-year period, the industry has done remarkably well. If you want to compare it with as many media forms as you like, with the exception of digital, the industry has held up amazingly well. And also, a company can be losing 1.5% of its square meters a year, but if it's raising prices at 5%, it doesn't mean its revenue is falling. And, on that basis, its revenue is going up at 3.5% a year. So it doesn't suggest that trade show companies are losing revenues. That's not what's happening at all.
Sure. And also, I read that you've done your own research, and evidence from the largest trade show group suggests that 2023 will be 16% ahead of 2019 in terms of net profit.
If you take the 7 largest groups, which you can name if you like, then on average, and actually it's an average of averages, around 15 to 20% ahead in 2023 as opposed to 2019. The one which, based on the numbers they themselves are giving out, which is running up a little bit behind, is Reed. RX. They've lost all of Russia, of course, which hit them hard. And they're still unsure about what's happening in China. But everybody else seems to be ahead of where they were. Again, you've got to. There's this problem here, which you've got to inflation discount it for the whole period. Let's just say 2000 to 2020. We didn't really talk about inflation in the industry. There was inflation, but it just was of such a level that it didn't really have any great material effect. In the last 2 years, inflation has had a material effect, and therefore trade show companies have been putting their prices up like everybody else has been putting their prices up. And therefore, if you talk about 15 to 20% ahead in terms of revenue and EBITDA, you've got to allow for the fact that inflation is having an effect in a way that it didn't have 5 years ago.
Sure. And what are you, in terms of the companies like CloserStill and 19 specifically, in terms of the number of exhibitors, just sticking with the UK for a minute, are you seeing the numbers consistent with previous? Because again, coming back to the report that we just mentioned, the size and scale and index report, it suggested in 22 that the percentage of companies exhibiting compared to 2015 was down around 71% at the 2015 level. What are you seeing in 23?
I think that 71% is just a freak number. I really do. I mean, I'd wait for 2023 before I read that. Well, again, I can obviously talk specifically about CloserStill and 19, but indeed, in both cases, for a number of reasons, they are just way ahead. I mean, CloserStill year on year this year is 27, will be, because by the end of April, you've got a pretty good idea what your numbers for the whole year are going to be, obviously. Will be 27% ahead, like for like, year on year. 19 rather better than that, but then 19 has got 2-3 shows. Its safety and security series, its emergency services show, and its retail technology show, which are just growing at a tremendous rate. So I don't necessarily think that applies to the whole industry. It's just that both companies happen to be in sectors which are very, very buoyant and which are doing extremely well.
Sure. I just want to turn quickly to conversion rates. So specifically on free to attend shows, and a lot of the trade shows are. Lots of people I speak to, read lots of commentary, are suggesting that, you know, maybe we're still getting the same people, numbers of people registering, but conversion rates are dropping. It's getting harder to mobilize people. And actually, when they do come, they're maybe expecting a slightly different experience. What's your view on conversion rates? Again, it's sort of general response across the board from people that you've spoken to.
Certainly the last quarter of 21 and the first half of 22, I would guess that conversion rates on average were probably no better than 35%.
Right.
But you have to be very careful how you read that. Of course, what everybody had were very, very large databases of people who registered for a show which didn't run in 20, didn't run in 21, and those names were still sitting there on the databases. And so they still counted as pre-registrants. But of course, as we all know, the later somebody registers for a show, far, far more likely they'll attend. If somebody registers for a show, and I'm just talking about on average 10 months out from a show, their likelihood of attendance is no more than 25%. If somebody registers in the week before a show, then their likelihood of attendance is around 70%. I'm speaking general stats over a long period of time. So I think that 35% number was real, but I think you've got to caveat it. And it's not really until now when we've got shows back on a normal annual cycle, and therefore with a normal annual cycle of registration, that we're seeing numbers that I think are you could regard as reliable. Certainly, talking about my own companies, I certainly think 50% plus would be normal, and in healthcare, rather better than that, because healthcare of its nature is likely to attract a more stable audience.
I think also healthcare and generally any other shows where this applies to, getting, you know, CPD credits, you know, certified professional development for attending a show, obviously will make a difference, I guess, in terms of people.
That's a very big part of it. Absolutely right, Dan. Yeah.
Sure.